Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back several hundred years to a world of timber-framed houses, muddy streets, and surprisingly loud roosters that nobody ever asked for. So get comfortable, dim the lights, let your phone notifications fade into oblivion, and let's settle in for a long, meandering wander through medieval England. Now, when we say middle class in the medieval sense, it's not really the middle class you're picturing. There was no suburban dad mowing the lawn in 1380, no mom doing the Target run. Instead, the so-called middling sort were a strange in-between group who weren't peasants slaving away in the fields, but also weren't aristocrats strutting around in ermine-lined cloaks. They were merchants, artisans, skilled craftsmen, local officials, and the occasional ambitious lawyer. Basically, the people who had just enough money to worry about losing it. So, what did their daily life actually look like? Well, let's just say it was a weird cocktail of muddy inconvenience, social climbing, and the eternal stench of unwashed humanity. Let's start with where they lived. If you picture neat little half-timbered houses with flower boxes under the windows, you've been sold the tourist-friendly version. Medieval middle-class homes were usually cramped, smoky, and just slightly tilted from centuries of bad carpentry. Many were built with wattle and daub, which is essentially mud and sticks slapped together and politely called architecture. If you had money, you might spring for stone walls, but those tended to make the house about as cozy as a damp cave. Inside, things weren't much better. The medieval idea of interior decoration was mostly put your best wooden chest in the room so people know you own something. Furniture was sparse. A few stools, a table that might collapse if someone leaned on it too hard, and maybe, if you were really doing well, an actual bed frame instead of a straw pallet on the floor. Curtains? Only if you could afford extra cloth. Otherwise, congratulations, your drafty house is everyone's business. And don't forget the fire. Every home had a hearth, which meant the air was constantly thick with smoke. You weren't cozying up by the fire so much as slowly marinating in it. People back then walked around smelling like a combination of smoked ham and wet wool, which was apparently the medieval version of Dior. Now food. Ah yes, the great medieval diet, famous for two things, bread and more bread. Middle-class households could afford better bread than the peasants, which basically meant it was less likely to break your teeth. It was made from wheat instead of rye or barley, and it came out lighter in color. That was considered classy. The whiter the bread, the higher your status, which is hilarious today, because modern health bread is all about being dark and grainy. Back then, eating that would basically scream, "I'm poor," and possibly dying. Meat was more common in middle-class households than in peasant huts, though don't picture endless feasts. You might have beef, pork, or mutton on Sundays or special occasions, but day-to-day meals were more like pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, sometimes with a hint of meat if you were lucky. It was filling, if not exactly exciting. Think of it as the medieval version of instant ramen. Fish was big too, especially since the church demanded meatless days, which was basically every Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and most of Lent. So you ended up eating a lot of salted herring. So much, in fact, that herring became the backbone of England's fish trade. Imagine your life revolving around barrels of preserved fish, and you've got a sense of the medieval culinary mood. And spices? Well, middle-class families could afford the occasional sprinkle of pepper, cinnamon, or cloves, imported luxuries that made you feel fancy. Never mind that your meat was often preserved to the point of resembling leather. Throw some cinnamon on it and suddenly you're sophisticated.
All right, let's move on to work. The medieval middle class works hard, which is ironic since today we tend to think of middle class as the people aspiring to relax. Merchants were constantly traveling, trying to avoid being robbed on muddy roads while hauling cloth or wine or, yes, more salted fish. Artisans were busy hammering, carving, or weaving in workshops that doubled as their living rooms. Bakers, brewers, tanners, smiths, These were all respectable trades, though the smell of a tannery would make you question your entire career path. And lawyers? Yes, even in medieval England, people hated lawyers. They were often seen as parasites living off other people's disputes, which, to be fair, they kind of were. But they were also some of the wealthiest of the middle class, because legal documents had to be written, argued, and sealed with excessive pomp. If you could read Latin and had a head for nitpicky detail, you were golden. Middle-class women also worked, not just in domestic chores, but often helping run the family business. A merchant's wife might handle bookkeeping, or even negotiate deals while her husband was away. Widows could inherit businesses and keep them running, which meant some women had surprising autonomy. Of course, society still preferred to remind them of their place, but reality was a bit more practical than the church sermons. Now let's float gently over to fashion. Medieval middle-class clothing was where people really showed off their ambition. They couldn't afford the silks and furs of the nobility, but they still wanted to strut through town looking important. So they went for bright colors, tailored fits, and flashy belts. Wool was the main fabric, but it was dyed in rich reds, greens, and blues. Shoes were pointed, sometimes absurdly so, because apparently the length of your shoe said something about your ego. And here's the kicker: sumptuary laws. Medieval England actually had rules about who could wear what, because God forbid a merchant look richer than a lord. If you were middle class, you could wear nice wool and some fur, but no ermine, no purple silk, and definitely no crowns. Not that many were trying. These laws weren't always enforced, but they show just how insecure the elites were about their status. Imagine telling someone today, sorry, you can't wear Gucci, that's for billionaires only. Daily life wasn't just work and bread. There was also religion, which was the Netflix of medieval England. Church was the center of community life, a mix of moral lectures, social networking, and occasional entertainment. The middle class would fund church renovations, donate to local festivals, and sometimes pay for their own private pews just to show off. It was basically the medieval version of getting your name on a donor plaque. And let's not forget the constant fear of the afterlife. Medieval middle-class families were obsessed with paying for prayers to shave time off their purgatory sentence. This is why guilds, those professional associations of craftsmen, often doubled as religious fraternities. You'd get career networking and spiritual insurance in one membership. Very efficient. And finally, let's glide into health and hygiene. Medieval middle-class life was slightly better off than peasants, but not by much. Their homes had privies, essentially outhouses, but chamber pots were common too. Bathing was irregular, partly because heating water was a chore, and partly because moralists kept insisting that too much bathing was sinful. Diseases like dysentery, smallpox, and the plague didn't care whether you owned a nice chest of drawers or not. Middle-class families were just as vulnerable as anyone else. And dentistry, let's just say if you had teeth into your 40s, you were ahead of the game. So, what's the big picture here? Medieval middle-class life in England was complicated. These people were ambitious, anxious about status, constantly working, and occasionally managing to enjoy a slice of salted fish with a sprinkle of pepper. They weren't peasants, but they weren't nobility either. They lived in that fragile middle zone where you could rise to prominence or fall right back down into obscurity. And honestly, isn't that kind of relatable? Part 2. The middling sort and their daily routines. So, let's pick up where we left off. We've talked about food, clothes, houses, and that faint smell of fish that seemed to haunt every corner of medieval England. Now let's drift into the slower rhythms of daily life. The routines, the family structures, the bits of leisure they squeezed in when they weren't busy making sure their roof didn't collapse. Let's start with education, because this is one of those things where being middle class really made a difference. Peasant children, they were out in the fields as soon as they could stand upright. But in the towns, middle-class parents sometimes sent their kids to grammar schools. These schools were usually attached to churches or cathedrals, which meant the curriculum was heavy on Latin. You learned to read, write, and pray, not necessarily in that order.
And here's the funny thing. Most people didn't need Latin in daily life. A baker didn't need to conjugate verbs to sell you a loaf. But Latin was the key to social climbing. It meant access to university, law, or the church, all professions that could haul your family up the ladder. So, parents scraped together the money, hoping little John or Alice would turn out clever enough to pay them back someday. Spoiler, some did, some didn't. If you were truly ambitious, you might send your son off to Oxford or Cambridge. Those universities were small, chaotic, and perpetually short on heating, but they were the ticket to status. Of course, surviving them meant lots of memorization, lectures in freezing halls, and the occasional brawl with townsfolk who hated students for being loud and entitled. So, not much has changed, really. Now, what about family life? Middle-class families weren't quite like modern nuclear families. They were more like little economic units where everyone was expected to contribute. Parents, children, apprentices, servants, all under one roof, all eating from the same pot, all breathing in the same smoky air. Marriage was a business decision as much as anything else. Yes, there might be affection, but dowries and alliances were the main concern. A merchant's daughter might marry another merchant's son to combine wealth or link two workshops together. Love was nice if it happened, but not strictly necessary. Honestly, it was more like merging companies. Children were valued, but let's not romanticize it. Infant mortality was high, so families often had several kids, expecting some wouldn't make it. Those who survived were put to work early, not just in chores, but often as apprentices. A boy might be sent to another household at the age of 7 or 8 to start learning a trade. Girls often stayed home to help with domestic work, unless their families could afford to apprentice them in something like silk weaving. Childhood was short, and toys were mostly whatever you could whittle out of wood scraps. And discipline? Let's just say medieval parents believed in firm correction. Wooden spoons weren't just for stirring porridge. Let's float over to leisure, because surprisingly, the middle class did find time for fun. And no, it wasn't binge-watching Netflix. Entertainment came in the form of festivals, fairs, and the occasional drunken street performance. Markets and fairs were huge. These weren't just about buying things, they were social events. Jugglers, musicians, and storytellers showed up. Ale flowed freely. People danced, gossiped, and occasionally got into fights about who was selling overpriced cloth. Think of it as a cross between a farmer's market and a frat party. Games were popular too. Middle-class men loved dice and gambling so much that laws were constantly being passed to restrict it, which of course only made it more fun. Board games like Nine Men's Morris and Backgammon existed, and if you were feeling particularly fancy, you might even play chess. And sports? Oh yes, they loved those. Football was a chaotic, violent mess involving entire towns, no rules, and the occasional broken leg. Archery was more respectable, partly because it was required by law. Every able-bodied man was supposed to practice with the longbow on Sundays because nothing says relaxing weekend like mandatory weapons training.
Now let's wander into the world of guilds, because no discussion of medieval middle-class life is complete without them. Guilds were basically the LinkedIn of the Middle Ages. If you were a craftsman, you joined your local guild. Bakers, tanners, weavers, blacksmiths, you name it. The guild regulated your trade, set prices, trained apprentices, and made sure you weren't producing complete garbage. Guilds also acted like social clubs. They had feast days, religious ceremonies, and sometimes paraded through town in costumes that probably looked ridiculous. They also provided a safety net. If you got sick or died, the guild might support your family. In return, you had to obey the rules, pay your fees, and occasionally show up at 6 a.m. meetings you definitely didn't want to attend. And don't forget the merchant guilds. These were even more powerful. They controlled trade routes, negotiated with towns, and basically acted like the early Chamber of Commerce if the Chamber of Commerce also doubled as a drinking club.
For ambitious middle-class men, guild membership was essential. It wasn't just about making a living, it was about building status. A guildsman could rise in town politics, fund church projects, and maybe even snag a position as mayor someday, which in medieval England was about as glamorous as it got. Religion, of course, ran through all of this. The middle class weren't monks, but they were very much invested in appearing pious. Guilds held masses. Families commissioned prayers for dead relatives. People went on pilgrimages, partly out of devotion, partly because it was the medieval version of a road trip. Shrines like Canterbury became bustling tourist spots, full of candles, souvenirs, and the occasional shady relic dealer trying to convince you that this bone definitely belonged to Saint whoever. And let's not underestimate how much anxiety the middle class had about purgatory. They worked hard, saved money, built businesses, and then spent half of it paying for masses to reduce their soul's waiting time. It's like spending your life savings on a cosmic fast pass ticket. So, what does all of this tell us? Middle-class life in medieval England wasn't glamorous, but it wasn't hopeless either. It was practical, ambitious, and slightly paranoid. These were people balancing on the thin line between security and collapse. They had nicer bread, louder shoes, and better houses than peasants, but they were always looking up, never quite satisfied, and always worried about sliding back down. And in that way, maybe they weren't so different from us. Part 3. Towns, cities, and the eternal smell of tanners. So picture it. You've woken up on a damp morning in 14th century England. The rooster has screamed at you, the hearth smoke is already making your eyes water, and now it's time to step outside into town. You open your crooked wooden door and, congratulations, you're hit with the full medieval sensory experience. The smell of tanneries, fish stalls, chamber pots emptied into the street, and maybe a whiff of bread baking if you're lucky. Honestly, the air was basically a roulette wheel of unpleasantness. But this was the middle-class environment. The town. Towns in medieval England weren't enormous, nothing like modern London. They were compact, walled, and often crammed along rivers or major roads. Population sizes varied wildly. A small town might only have a few hundred souls, while London itself, the giant, managed around 80,000 people by the late Middle Ages, which to us is like a mid-sized football stadium, but to them it was the intimidating big city. The streets? Narrow, muddy, and perpetually clogged. Animals wandered freely, pigs, chickens, stray dogs, and carts got stuck in the muck. There were no sidewalks, no traffic laws, and definitely no garbage pickup. Middle-class houses lined these streets, their upper floors jutting out so far that two neighbors could probably shake hands from the window without leaving the house. Convenient, but also a great way to make sure your entire neighborhood smelled your cooking.
Now, the marketplace. This was the beating heart of middle-class town life. The market square was where everything happened. Trade, gossip, performances, arguments, and the occasional brawl. Merchants set up stalls selling cloth, leather goods, bread, pottery, salted fish, basically whatever you couldn't grow yourself. Middle-class families were deeply tied to these markets. Merchants relied on them to sell imported goods. Artisans used them to hawk their wares, and townsfolk wandered in to see what looked affordable. Bargaining was constant. Prices weren't fixed, so you haggled until one of you gave up in frustration. Imagine Black Friday shopping, but every single week. And fairs? Oh, fairs were even bigger. A fair license was a town's golden ticket. It meant people would travel from all over the region to buy, sell, drink, and make bad decisions. You'd see exotic goods like spices, fine cloths, and maybe even strange animals. A middle-class family could make or lose a fortune depending on how the fair went. Let's float over to town politics because the middle class were very much in charge of that scene.
Nobles weren't usually running the daily affairs of towns. That job fell to local officials, mayors, aldermen, bailiffs, most of whom came straight from merchant and guild backgrounds. Elections were, well, elections in the loosest sense. Usually the same handful of wealthy families took turns running things. Votes were limited, corruption was common, and guilds had enormous influence. But for a middle-class man, town politics was the ultimate status climb. If you could serve as mayor, you weren't just running the town. You were essentially proving to everyone that your family mattered. Of course, with that prestige came headaches. You had to enforce rules, take taxes, and deal with complaints like, "My neighbor keeps dumping fish guts outside my door." Glamorous, it was not. We can't talk about towns without mentioning sanitation, or more accurately, the total lack of it. Middle-class houses sometimes had private privies, but most waste ended up in cesspits or directly in the street. Chamber pots were emptied out of windows, sometimes onto unsuspecting passers-by. And water? Wells were shared. Streams doubled as sewers, and drinking straight from the river was basically a dare. This, of course, led to disease. Outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and plague swept through towns regularly. The Black Death hit hardest in urban centers, wiping out nearly half the population in some places. Middle-class families weren't immune, though they sometimes had a slightly better chance of fleeing to the countryside if things got really bad. And yet, despite all this, people somehow adjusted. The smell became background noise. The risk of disease just part of life. Humans are annoyingly adaptable that way. Now, what about housing in towns? We touched on this before, but it's worth lingering. Middle-class houses in towns doubled as workplaces. A shoemaker, for instance, might have his shop in the front room, the workshop behind, and the family's living space upstairs. The house wasn't just a home, it was a billboard for the business. Passers-by could see the goods, hear the hammering, and smell the leather. Space was tight, so upper floors often jutted over the street, creating those overhanging facades that look quaint today, but were probably a nightmare in practice. Fire was a constant threat. One spark from a hearth, and your entire street could go up. Which is why some towns passed laws requiring people to keep buckets of water on hand. Of course, enforcing those laws was another story. Let's glide toward law and order, or what passed for law and order. Middle-class townsfolk were constantly navigating rules, fines, and punishments. Town courts dealt with everything from property disputes to bad bread. Yes, there were laws about bread. Bakers could be fined or even publicly shamed if they sold loaves that were underweight. Nothing ruined your reputation faster than being known as a bread cheat. Other punishments were more theatrical. Stocks, pillories, and public shaming were common. A dishonest merchant might find himself standing in the marketplace with his crime announced to all. Middle-class respectability was fragile, and one bad incident could follow you for years. That's why guilds enforced high standards. If your trade reputation collapsed, your whole livelihood went with it. Honestly, middle-class life was one long exercise in reputation management. Finally, let's drift into the soundscape of a medieval town. Because it wasn't just sights and smells, it was noisy. Church bells rang constantly, marking the hours, calling to prayers, warning of fires. Street hawkers shouted their wares, blacksmiths hammered, carts rattled, dogs barked. And at night, the noise quieted, but never disappeared. People sang drunkenly in the streets after fairs. Cats fought in alleys, and night watchmen clanged bells to prove they were awake. So, when you picture medieval middle-class town life, don't think peaceful cobblestone strolls. Think cramped streets, constant noise, overwhelming smells, and an endless hustle to keep up appearances. And yet, for the middling sort, this was the good life. It was better than mud huts in the fields, and, with luck, it could be the first step towards real influence.
Part 4. Money, Trade, and the Art of Not Going Broke. So far, we've wandered through the homes, streets, guild halls, and market stalls of the medieval middle class. But now it's time to get to the heartbeat of their world: money. Not coins jingling noblemen's purses, and not the scraps peasants were scraping together, but that fragile layer of wealth that kept the middling sort constantly teetering between comfort and ruin. Let's start with the basics. Currency. Medieval England ran on coins, mostly silver pennies, with farthings, halfpennies, and groats filling in the gaps. Gold coins came in later, like the noble, which was about as fancy as pocket change ever got. But here's the thing. Money was perpetually in short supply. Literally. There weren't enough coins in circulation for the growing economy, so people had to get creative with credit, tallies, and promises. The crown didn't help much. Kings loved to recoin money, melt down the old coins, stamp out new ones, and take a healthy cut of silver in the process. This meant your savings could suddenly be worth less, because why not let the monarchy mess with the economy whenever it needed war funds? Stability was not exactly the medieval financial strong suit. For the middle class, trade was everything. Merchants hauled goods across England and beyond, dealing in wool, cloth, salt, fish, wine, and sometimes more exotic imports like spices. Wool was king, England's great export. The sheep of the Midlands were basically the foundation of the entire medieval economy. If you were a merchant dealing in wool or cloth, you were in the elite ranks of the middle class, with real potential to climb higher. But trade wasn't easy. Roads were terrible, carts broke down, and bandits lurked everywhere. Sea travel was faster, but came with storms, pirates, and customs officials who always seemed suspiciously greedy. Merchants had to calculate risks constantly. Do you send your goods overland and risk theft, or by sea and risk sinking? Either way, insurance wasn't exactly an option. You just prayed hard and diversified. And then there were shops. Many middle-class families combined home and business into one building. The shop was at the front, displaying goods behind shutters that opened onto the street. The living quarters were tucked behind or above. Picture a cramped, smoky combination of storefront, workshop, and bedroom. Privacy was a luxury, but at least you could roll out of bed and straight into work. Shops were competitive. Bakers, butchers, and cloth sellers set up near one another, and price wars broke out regularly. That's why guilds tried to regulate things, to stop everyone from undercutting each other into poverty. Still, customers haggled endlessly, and middle-class shopkeepers had to balance quality with cost. Sell bread too heavy with fillers, and you risked fines. Price your cloth too high, and customers went to your rival. Now let's talk about the financial juggling act of a middle-class household. Income came from trade, craft, or professional services. Expenses included food, clothing, guild fees, apprenticeships, and church donations. Oh, and don't forget dowries. If you had daughters, you needed to save up enough to marry them respectably. That alone could sink a family's finances. Many middle-class families took loans. And this is where medieval finance gets messy. Officially, the church banned usury, charging interest on loans. But practically, everyone did it anyway, just under different names. Wealthy merchants lent money. Jews were often forced into money lending because other jobs were barred to them. And clever contracts disguised interest as fees. If you borrowed money, you paid more back. The paperwork just avoided the word interest. Fail to repay, and your reputation crumbled. Credit was personal, no banks to hide behind.
If you defaulted, everyone knew, and suddenly no one would lend you a penny. It was financial exile.
Middle-class ambition often pushed families into real estate. Buying property or even just leasing better workshops was a way to secure status. Town property was valuable, especially if it sat near a market square or along a busy street. Of course, property disputes were endless. Boundaries blurred, walls collapsed, and lawsuits piled up. Some families spent more money fighting over a strip of land than the land was actually worth, because pride is priceless apparently. And then there was taxation, the eternal headache. The crown and local lords constantly demanded money. Towns had to pay for royal charters, wars, and random emergencies like, oops, the king wants to invade France again. Taxes fell hard on the middle class because peasants had little to give and nobles had the political clout to dodge payments. Merchants and artisans, stuck in the middle, ended up footing the bill. Tax collectors weren't popular. Shocker, I know. Dodging taxes was an art form involving underreporting goods, smuggling, or simply pleading poverty. But if you got caught, fines could destroy your livelihood. So middle-class families grumbled, paid up, and prayed the next levy wouldn't be worse. Despite all these challenges, the middle class developed an early sense of financial culture. They wrote wills, kept account books, and made careful investments. Many donated money to the church in hopes of eternal benefits. Some even founded chapels or almhouses, blending piety with prestige. Others funded bridges, roads, or schools because civic generosity looked good on your resume even in the afterlife. And through all this, the middle class became the backbone of England's economy. They weren't rolling in gold, but their steady trade, taxes, and ambition built towns into thriving centers. The nobles may have strutted around with titles, but it was the merchants, guildsmen, and artisans who actually kept the machine running. So, what was medieval middle-class finance really like? Stressful, ambitious, forever one bad harvest, one shipwreck, or one tax levy away from collapse. But also, surprisingly modern. They budgeted, invested, worried about debt, and dreamed of upward mobility. In short, they were basically us, only smellier.